The book of First Peter. A couple weeks ago, we went through First Peter chapter 1, which was a lot of information to get through. So I split chapter 2 of Peter into two. And really there's two thoughts. There's two focuses of chapter 2. First Peter chapter 2. And I labeled this lesson, The Joy of Adulthood. And the reason I labeled it that is because if you think about as teenagers, I remember when I was a teenager, I could not wait to be an adult. I could not wait to leave the house because that meant I had my freedom, right? I could do what I wanted. Nobody was telling me what to do. And in reality, that was fake, right? Because when you become an adult, that's not really the case. But many times you hear that. And so I labeled it the joy of adulthood from a teenager's perspective. No one telling me what to do, but the problem is there's always someone we must submit to. Several years ago, Cassie and Matt, when they were younger, I'm going to talk about them. We were riding. It was when we were in Memphis. We were riding around, and they were talking about them listening to mom and dad and the rules that we had. And I talked about the fact that, surprise to them, as adults, I have to listen to someone. I have to submit to someone. Ultimately, God, right? Because we're subject to God. We talked about being subject to the government. And if we have a job, for our bosses, being subject to our bosses. And so we talked about that, and in a way it was a surprise to them that when they became an adult, they still had to submit to somebody. And so when I think about that, that came to mind when I've looked at 1 Peter 2, specifically verse 13 and following. Because Peter deals with that issue here, that idea, that command to submit. And he's writing to Christians. And what I want to do is look at this passage, and we're going to divide it in three parts to see three things here, that areas of our life that we are to be submissive, as Peter shows us. And so the first one is submitting as a citizen. As a citizen. You and I are citizens of the United States. There might be some people, I know there's some people in other countries that listen to our live feed, I've seen. And so they're subject to the citizenship of their country. But you and I are citizens of the United States. And so in that aspect, we are to submit as a citizen. And starting in verse 13. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13, it says, "Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good." First thing we notice is that we are to submit ourselves to every ordinance of man. We are subject to all authorities. I forgot to underline my words that you guys have blank, so hopefully we'll cover them all this morning. But we are to be subject to all authorities. The first one, it says, is to kings. Now, you and I don't live in that type of world or country where we have a king, a dictatorship. You got to think about the time that they were living in at this time. They did. They were living under Nero. We're going to talk about him in a little bit. They were living under Nero at this time. But there was pockets of groups in the world before Rome that you saw democracy. Greece was a dictatorship. But the southern part of Greece, Athens and that area, had a democracy. They had what we would call like a Congress, a Senate, that would make decisions for that area. And so this principle is talked about here. Doesn't matter if it's a democracy or it's a kingship government. We are to submit to those authorities, if we like them or not. We've had many presidents throughout the history of the United States, and a person may not like every one of them. But they're put there, and we're going to see, by God. We're to submit to their authority, to their rule, in a sense. You think about it, we're like, well, it's easy to do that under a government that we like, that's going the way, making policies the way we like. It's easy to do that because we agree. But it's harder when it's the other way around. Now think about Peter writing to the people of his time. Rome controlled the world at that time, the known world in a sense. They owned majority of the world. And the ruler at that time was Nero. Nero was pretty savage. He killed Christians. He would take Christians and he would light his garden with them as torches, alive. He would have his gladiator games where they would kill Christians in the center of thousands of people watching for a sport. And so you think about them at that time looking at what Peter is writing here and saying, wow, we're supposed to submit to Nero. Someone that hates us. Someone that wants to kill us. We're supposed to submit to them. One way that we can submit, I think about this. I want to put this here, but it applies to all of this. Go to 1 Timothy chapter 2. Paul writing to Timothy, talks a little bit about this. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, and look at verse 1 through 2. Therefore I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving thanks be made for all men. That's easy. We read that and we say, we're supposed to pray for one another. And we do. We have our prayer list. Many times during our prayers, we think of those that are on our minds. We pray for all men. But continue on, verse 2. For kings and all who are in authority, that they may lead a quiet and peaceful life in all godliness and reverence. We are to pray for our leaders. We like them or not. We're to pray for them. And so when we think about Peter saying to submit, the word submitting means to submit oneself, to render obedience, to be submissive. That means to recognize them as superior to us and submitting under their authority. They were to submit to the authority of Nero at that time. And so when we think about that, it's a little easier to submit to the government that we have today. The next one is to governors. To governors. Now the governors were the lesser of the officers. They would be the leaders or officers. And so when we think about today, it could be the governors, our state, Iowa or Missouri, either one. The governor state, but they were to submit to the authority of the governors. The kings gave the authority to the governors, and the governors had authority to work. But not only that, Peter states, to those that enforce the laws, to those that go out and enforce the rules that are out there. That would include our police officers and many others, etc. They would fall under that. They have authority. They've been given authority. And so notice he says here to those, and also in good and bad. If they're good or bad, we're still to submit to their authority. Go to Acts 5. If the laws or rules go against God's law, what is the thing that we're supposed to do? We've always got to talk about this, because we talk about submitting to the government, to all authorities, things like that. But we need to remember Acts 5 and verse 28 and 29. It says, saying, did we not strictly command you not to teach in his name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring the man's blood on us. Here the rulers are rebuking Peter and the apostles for what they're doing, for what they're preaching. And look at verse 29. But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Is the law that, we need, when we look at the laws that we are to follow today, that are put in effect by our government, is the law in harmony with God's law? If it isn't, we don't follow it. If it goes against God's law, we are to not obey it. There might be a time in our country where they say we cannot preach on certain topics. I think in Canada, they're not supposed to preach on homosexuality. That goes against God's law. And that is still to be preached. And so we are to be subject to our authorities only when it doesn't contradict God's law. And so that means in things that we don't like, paying taxes, obeying different laws that are in this world. If it's not against God's law, then we are to follow it. You know, Jesus paid taxes. Go to Romans 13. We'll connect this. We can't talk about this subject without going to Romans 13. But Romans 13, look at verse 1 through 6. I want to spend a lot of time here, but I want to focus on a couple things. It says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Notice that. Those that are in that position of authority are there because God put them there. Good or bad. Has God used bad leaders, bad rulers throughout history? He has. Sometimes for the benefit of teaching Israel a lesson. Maybe the leaders that we have today are because we deserve it as a country. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment upon themselves. Notice first, since God put them there in that state of authority, when we go against their authority, we go against God. And so, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. We're going to talk about that some more. But if we want to not deal with some of the things that we may have to see for dealing with authorities, do what's good and have their praise. Verse 4, for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes. For they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to their all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, custom to customs, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. Why do we obey man's laws? For the Lord's sake. We obey man's laws to avoid punishment. You think about punishment from the government or punishment from those in authority. We also obey man's laws to keep our conscience clear, as Romans 13 shows us. And then last, to obey God. Our doing good will put to silence foolish men. Go back to 1 Peter chapter 2. Look at verse 15 through 16. 1 Peter 2, 15 through 16. It says, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. And so our doing good will put to silence foolish men. We should be the best citizens around, is really what it is. Peter is saying you, as a citizen of the Roman Empire under Nero, who is trying to kill you, are to still be the best citizen you can be. Pay your taxes. Listen to their authority. And respect them and honor them. That means we are to obey our civil governments. We are to pay our taxes. You know, there's a lot of other things you could think about with that. Not to rise up against them because they're in authority. There's a lot of things we could think about that with that. Maybe it will caution us when we argue publicly or blast them out publicly on Facebook or social media. We need to be careful of that. Are we bringing honor to them? Are we showing them honor? Are we showing them the respect that we should show them if we do that? Something to think about. And so we are to silence or muzzle. The word silence there means to muzzle or gag. Those that want to say that Christians are rebellious, which was probably something that was going on at that time. They were considering Christians as rebellious. But when we do what we are to do, and we follow and we honor their authority, and we show that respect, then we, in a way, will prove them differently. Those in power are given that power from God, and we should respect that. We are to live a right and honest life. And so verse 17 he finishes up this thought about government by looking at verse 17. It says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. We are to show respect to all people. You know, that's just something that our society just needs to learn. We need to show one another respect to everyone, even if they want to mock us, or maybe they want to spit upon, things like that. No matter what, if they hate us, we're still to show them respect, because all people deserve to be shown respect. If we want to be shown respect, we've got to earn it by showing others respect. And so we are to respect all people. The second one is the brotherhood, to love the brotherhood. We need to show one another respect as brothers and sisters in Christ. And then we are to show respect to God. See, God ultimately deserves that respect. Proverbs chapter 1, I encourage you to read this. Proverbs 1 and verse 7 says the beginning of knowledge, the beginning of wisdom in other places is the fear of God. It's having that awe, that reverence to God. And then we're to show respect to those that are in authority. All of these groups that we are to show respect to show us that when we do that, we show to others that we are followers of God. And so Peter focuses on us as citizens and how we are to submit to their authority. And we got to remember, we're to submit to their authority in the good and in the bad. And we'll talk about that more later. Second, Peter then talks about submitting as a servant. Now, you got to think about the Roman Empire at this time. Rome, it was believed that there was more slaves in Rome than there was free people. And so the Bible talks a lot about being a slave or being a servant, because there was a lot of Christians that were. And then that idea of that servitude, or that idea, sometimes it was from being conquered, a nation being conquered. But a lot of times it was because a person was indebted to somebody else. They had a debt to pay. And so they worked for that debt to be paid off. And so that principle really can be focused on us. So when we think about submitting as a servant, think about submitting as an employee, as one that is working in our community. So verse 18 through 20, he says, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the harsh. They were to serve, we are to be obedient even as a servant of another. Notice here he says that they were to serve with all fear. Fear of punishment. Their punishment could be something a lot worse than today. Us, we could be written up or be fired for not submitting to our employer. And also they were to fear because they didn't want to disobey God. Maybe being a fear of a reproach on Christ. What does it mean to be a reproach on Christ? If we do not show the respect that we are to our employers, to our government, we bring a bad name to Christ as Christians. And so we have to think about that. And notice Peter said here, they were to submit to their masters with fear, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the harsh. And it's interesting he has both. There is good masters or good bosses, and in that sense, it's easy to say, you know what, I can get away with stuff. I don't have to listen to him. He's really nice. He's very gentle. I don't have to worry about it. But then on the other side, it could be the harsh, where they are harsh, and we say, you know what, I'm not going to listen to them because they don't treat me very well. In both situations, Peter says they were to submit and be obedient to them. And obedience to masters is commendable. Look at verse 19. He says, for this is commendable if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. What is morally right by God is to be obedient to them even if they're not good. And that's hard to say. It's easy to say, it's hard to apply. In a situation where you're being treated bad, it's easy to say, you know what, I'm not going to respect them. I'm not going to show them the honor that they they'd really deserve. It's easy to do that. Peter says here, even if they're not doing good, even if they're harsh, we're to still show them respect. What is morally right by God is to be obedient to them, even if they're not good. Because think about this. God knows the work and the misconduct of an evil master. God remembers that. And God takes care of that in due time. By showing that respect and obedience when you're not treated right, it glorifies God. You know, the world, when they're treated badly or harshly, the world responds with resentment. The world responds with rebellion. Or maybe if it's a good master, a good situation, when they're treated well, they may abuse that situation and not do as they should. But as a Christian, we are to respond cheerfully and without complaint. That is hard to apply. I cannot stand here and say that that's easy for me to do. When I'm treated harshly in any situation in life, to show that respect to that person. Or if and I've been in the situations before where it was, you're not treated the best, to show that respect to your boss or that situation. But as a Christian, we are to respond differently than the rest of the world. See, the Christian knows that God is watching. The Christian knows that God is watching. And so then look at verse 20 as he finishes up this part. He says, "For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable for God." In their situation, they may be beaten. They may be treated terribly in their situation. And Peter is saying here, God is pleased with you when you do the right thing. We will receive praise for doing what is right in God's eyes. We will have a good name among others. And if we suffer because of wrongdoings of others, God will bless us. And so Peter talks about us as a citizen. He talks about the good and the bad, that we are to still submit as a Christian and to show that honor and respect to those that are in authority as a Christian, even if it's good or bad. And then he talks about in a servant-master situation. We can apply that today, that we are to still show that respect and honor to those that are in that authority. And we can sit here and go, that's really hard to do. Why would I do that? Why would I show that honor and that respect to someone that doesn't treat me well? That brings us to the third thing. Submitting as a Christian. There's a reason why we are to do that. And we have a perfect example of that. Submitting as a Christian. The last part of this chapter, from verse 21 through 25, really focuses on why we should submit to all authority, even when it's not just, even when it's not good. Why, as a Christian, we should still show that respect, why we should still honor, why we should still be obedient. And that starts in verse 21. It says, "For to you this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps." Verse 22, "Who committed no sin, nor is deceit found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously." Christ submitted himself to all authority, even to the point of death. Think about that. Christ, innocent, perfect, did nothing wrong, did not yell at someone, did not curse at someone. He didn't treat someone bad. He treated everyone good. He healed people. He was perfect. And yet he submitted to those that were in authority, even to the point of death. Verse 22 and 23 show us he submitted to all authority, even though they were unjustly accusing him and treating him terribly. Look at some examples. Go with me to Matthew 26. I want us to think about that as we go through this. Matthew 26 and verse 65 through 68. while he was reviled. 1 Peter 22 and 23 showed us that when he was reviled, the word reviled there means abused. When he was abused, he did not return that abuse. He did not retaliate. In Matthew 26, look at verse 65 and 68. It says, Pilate said to them, "You have a guard, go your way. Make it as secure." Chapter 26. I'm in the wrong chapter, sorry. Chapter 26, 65. Says, "Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, 'He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?' They answered and said, 'He is deserving of death.' And they spat in his face and beat him. And others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, 'Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is the one who struck you?'" Who is doing these things? He is in front of the Sanhedrin. He is in front of the authorities at that time in the Jewish religion. He was being beaten. He was being falsely accused. He was being blasphemed, spit upon. Yet he never retaliated. Go to chapter 27. Look at verse 12 through 14. "And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to him, 'Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?' But he answered him not a word, so that the governor marveled greatly. All of these accusations he was lied about and accused falsely, yet he did not retaliate." Go down to verse 27. It says, "Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole garrison around him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. Then they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews.' Then they spat on him, and they took the reed and struck him on the head. And then they mocked him. Then they took the robe off him, put on his own clothes on him, and led him away to be crucified. He was beaten and mocked by those in authority." Look at verse 45 now. "Now from the 6th hour to the 9th hour there was darkness over the land. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, 'Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?' That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of those who stood there, when they heard that, said, "This man is calling for Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and offered it to him to drink. The rest said, "Let him alone. Let us see Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. He died on the cross, an innocent man. Innocent. Never done wrong. Yet he showed an example of submitting to those in authority. When he was reviled, when he was abused, he did not return that abuse. Notice also, Peter said in 1 Peter 2, when he suffered pain, he did not threaten their lives. Now, I think that's very interesting. That pain that he went through, which was an excruciating pain, he did not threaten them. Now, you and I, being able to threaten someone, we could say, ultimately, I'm going to get you back for that. I'm going to hurt you. But I do not have the power that Jesus did. When Jesus can make a threat, that is scary. Go to Matthew 26 now. And verse 52 through 54. But Jesus said to him, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide with me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus?" Jesus had the power. We sang the song. He could have called 10,000 angels. Jesus could have called at that moment 10,000 angels to annihilate everyone. And he wouldn't have to go through that. But yet, he chose to submit to their authority. He, through all that, submitted himself to the will of God. You know, you and I, thankfully, will not have to go through what Jesus did. You and I will not have to deal with being beaten and spit upon and put on a cross for something we didn't do, hopefully. But what we can learn from this is that Christ set a perfect example. He set an example of when those that were in authority were doing wrong to him, he didn't retaliate. He still showed honor. He still showed that respect to them. You and I can do the same things. You know, in our situations, if we are at a job where we're being treated harshly, we have the choice to leave and go somewhere else. But in that situation, we still need to show that respect and show that honor to that person that's in authority, and do not retaliate. Do not do something that defames the name of Christ. That's what we can pick from this. Because Christ left that perfect example. But not only did Christ deal with the pain, the suffering from those that physically beat him and hurt him. Go to verse 20. Go back to 1 Peter chapter 2. Look at verse 24. It says, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. He submitted himself to the pain of the cross, even though you and I treated him unjustly and terribly too. Yeah, you and I were not there physically beating Jesus, spitting upon him, mocking him, blaspheming him, and putting him on the cross. But you and I put him there. In Romans chapter 5, look at verse 6 through 8. Romans 5, verse 6 through 8. It says, for when we were still without strength in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, and while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were outside of Christ, sinning, transgressing the law. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4 tells us that when we sin, we transgress the law. When we do those things, it's in a sense of us standing there and spitting in his face and mocking him and putting him on that cross. While you and I are in that state of as sin, as a sinner, you and I put him there. And yet, because of that, Christ still went to the cross for you and I. Christ still showed an example of submitting to the will of God for you and I. Christ left us an example that we should follow in his steps. That's what verse 21 told us, 1 Peter 2:21. So what does that mean? How do we apply that to ourselves? That means we submit to all authority, even when it's not just. You know, not every government out there is just. Our government's not that way. There's some times where things are not right. The things that they do. When they try to enforce things upon us as Christians, we're still to submit to their authority and show them that respect. That means we submit to all authority even when it's not fair. That means we submit to all authority even when it could bring us harm or death. We look at that example that Christ set and we apply that to our lives by giving the honor to those that deserve that honor because of the position they're in. We show the respect that we are to show to those in authority because God put them there. We submit to the rules, the laws of this government, as of this state, of this county, as citizens because of the example that Christ left for us. And so ultimately, when we see all that Christ endured for us, so that we could be righteous, doesn't it cause us to fall to our knees and submit to him? It should. You know, Galatians 2 and verse 20, Paul said, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith, the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul recognized all that Christ went through. His submitting to those in authority when he was innocent. Submitting to that death on the cross, even though Paul was guilty of that. And he fell to his knees. He crucified self and followed Christ. Matthew 16, verse 24, Jesus tells us, if we want to be followers of him, we deny ourselves, we pick up our cross and follow him. Christ left that perfect example. You know, you and I may not agree with all that are in authority today, but God has commanded us to submit to their authority, to show that honor, to show that respect. Even when things in this world seem to get worse, and unfortunately, if oppression starts to come, we need to remember that example that Christ left for us. He endured to bring that glory to himself and to God. When we submit to all authority, that all their authority, we give glory to God also. We put to shame the foolish. We are pleasing to God. And then ultimately, we lay up those treasures that are in heaven. Think about that. We bring that glory that will come in the future, in eternity. You know, we talked about what Christ did for you and I, that example that he left, all that he submitted himself to do, for you and I to be righteous. And you and I can follow that plan of salvation that's been laid out for us. And when we do that, and we go down in that watery baptism, and we have our sins washed away, we are now sinless, on our way to heaven. And all of that is possible because of what Christ endured on the cross for you and I. So if you're not a Christian today, I pray that you think about that. Think about that sacrifice. Read Matthew 26, Matthew 27, and look what Jesus endured for you because he loved you. And as Romans 5 stated, when we were yet sinners, Christ died for the ungodly, for you and I, so that we could be righteous. And you can be righteous, have your garments washed clean with the blood of Christ by being baptized into Christ. And you can do that today. Or if you maybe fallen away and you need that encouragement to come back, to get back on that path, we can pray with you, we can help you. I pray that you don't wait,